The 21st century was not the first new normal faced by humanity. There were collective disruptions experienced by the people since time immemorial, but these disruptions only paved way to changes. The pains of birth. The story of mankind was not at all smooth, seamless, and without challenge. Europe was the battlefield of these changes, yet they coped, they survived, and they thrived. So there is no reason for us today that we cannot hurdle the so-called disruptions. We have each other to rely and depend because we are family after all. Humanity is one big family. Thus we will survive this crisis and any crisis for that matter. In the 15th century, the medieval view of the world began to disintegrate. By the late 17th century, educated Europeans no longer believed in it. Thus, the collapse of medieval institutions such as feudalism and serfdom had an intellectual parallel. No movement was as important in shaping the modern worldview as the scientific revolution of the 17th century. It made physical nature a valid object for experimental inquiry and mathematical calculation. For the new science to arise, a philosophical break with the medieval conception of nature had to occur. The medieval approach to nature sought to explain nature's appearances. To the naked eye, the Earth seems to be in the center of our universe. Medieval philosophy explained how and why the Earth was in the center, how and why heavy bodies fell toward it and light ones rose away from it. The philosophical revolution of the 17th century demolished such explanations. At the heart of the scientific revolution was the assumption that appearances could lie, that truth lay in conceptualizing the universe as an abstract entity, as matter in motion, as geometrical shapes, and as weight and number. The universe became a mechanism. The scientific revolution brought a new, mechanical conception of nature that enabled Westerners to discover and explain the laws of nature mathematically. They came to see nature as composed solely of matter, whose motion, occurring in space and measurable by time, is governed by the push and pull of bodies and by laws of force. This philosophically elegant construction unified nature as composed of atoms, knowable and even possibly manageable. It led to the formulation of a science of mechanics that could be employed in an industrial setting. What have we learned from history? What does it teach us in the 21st century? Last time we talk about Europe from ancient civilization to Middle Ages, Renaissance and Reformation and how each period contributed in shaping Europe's landscape. Each phase shaped Europe's history. The scientific revolution was decisive in shaping the modern mentality. It shattered the medieval view of the universe and replaced it with a wholly different worldview. Gone was the belief that a motionless Earth lay at the center of a universe that was finite and enclosed by a ring of stars. Gone, too, was the belief that the universe was divided into higher and lower worlds and that the laws of motion operating in the heavens were different from those working on Earth. Nature could be mastered conceptually and mathematically. Perhaps the critical factor making for the success of the scientific revolution lay in the acceptance and use of the new science by educated elites. Without such acceptance, the science of Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Boyle, and Newton would have remained the specialized knowledge of the few, or, worse still, a suspect, even heretical, approach to nature. Galileo could not have succeeded as much as he did in disseminating his theories despite the hostility of the Church without his large European following and his many aristocratic patrons, particularly in Florence. The scientific revolution ultimately weakened traditional Christianity. God's role in a mechanical universe was not clear. Newton had argued that God not only set the universe in motion but still intervened in its operations, thus leaving room for miracles. Others retained a place for God as creator but regarded miracles as limitations on nature's mechanical perfection. Applied to religious doctrines, Descartes' reliance on methodical doubt and clarity of thought and Bacon's insistence on careful observation led thinkers to question the validity of Christian teachings. Two theories of the universe. The geocentric theory envisioned an Earth-centered universe. This idea was first proposed by Aristotle. It was later supported by Ptolemy. The heliocentric theory envisioned a sun-centered universe. This idea was proposed by a Polish astronomer, Nicolaus Copernicus, during the Renaissance. It was supported by the Italian astronomer, Galileo. The Catholic Church supported the geocentric theory because it was consistent with religious doctrine that God had made the Earth a special place in the universe for 1,500 years. The Church supported almost all of Aristotle's scientific theories as fact. The Copernican revolution. Nicolaus Copernicus was born in Poland in 1473. As a young man, he enrolled at the University of Krakow, where he may have come under the influence of Renaissance Platonism, which was spreading outward from the Italian city-states. Copernicus also journeyed to Italy, and in Bologna and Padua he might have encountered ancient Greek texts containing arguments for the sun being the center of the universe. We know very little about his early education. Copernicus became convinced that the sun was at the center of the universe. So he began a lifelong task to work out mathematical explanations of how a heliocentric universe operated. Galileo used the telescope, which he invented, to study the movement of the planets and published works supporting Copernicus' heliocentric theory. Catholic clergy members had Galileo brought before the Inquisition, where he was forced to recant his findings under threat of excommunication and torture too. Despite his public recant of his theory, church officials placed Galileo under house arrest for the rest of his life in an attempt to silence him. Scientific discoveries validate the heliocentric theory. The later findings of Johannes Kepler, a Danish mathematician, used data to prove the heliocentric theory. He also discovered that planets have elliptical, not circular, orbits around the Sun. Sir Isaac Newton was the pioneer of modern physics. He was an English scientist who developed the law of gravity to explain the movement of the planets. This further confirmed the heliocentric theory. Law of gravity 2. His theories asserted that all celestial bodies are attracted to each other by an invisible force directly related to the mass of the object 3. Newton believed that God had designed the universe like a giant clock, with gravity dominating its motions. The scientific method. The scientific approach used by Copernicus and Galileo eventually turned into a new approach to science called the scientific method. The scientific method involves the following steps: developing a question, forming a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis through experiments, analysis of data, forming a conclusion. Francis Bacon. The decidedly practical and empirical Francis Bacon stands as the most important English proponent of the new science, though not its most important practitioner. Bacon was Lord Chancellor of England under James I, and he wrote about the usefulness of science partly in an effort to convince the Crown of its advantages. He wanted science to serve the interests of strong monarchy and also to improve the human condition through better medicine and application. René Descartes, a French philosopher, went to the best French schools and was trained by the Jesuits in mathematics and scholastic philosophy. Yet in his early 20s, he experienced a crisis of confidence and came to the conclusion that everything he had been taught was irrelevant and meaningless. Descartes began to search within himself for what he could be sure was clear and distinct knowledge. All he could know with certainty was the fact of his existence, and even that he knew only because he experienced not his body but his mind. I think, therefore I am. From this point of certitude, Descartes deduced the existence of God and of nature. He argued that science should be grounded on the human mind's ability to arrive at clear and distinct ideas, to think for itself and not slavishly follow tradition or doctrine. God exists because Descartes had in his mind an idea of a supreme, perfect being, and, Descartes reasoned, this idea could have been put there only by such a being, not by any ordinary mortal. Therefore, God's existence means that the physical world must be real, for no creator would invent a vast hoax. For Descartes, the new science meant confidence, in his own mind, in the knowability of the physical world, and in mathematics and reason. Scientific thought meant an alternative to everything he associated with the medieval: confusion, disorder, conflict between church and state, fear of the unknown, and magic. If the scientific revolution had a revolutionary, it was Descartes. Trained by the Jesuits and a devout Christian, Descartes nevertheless turned his back on scholasticism and based learning on the power of the individual mind. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, rallied generations of inquirers as did Descartes' mechanical understanding of matter in motion. The social implications of the scientific revolution. Perhaps the critical factor making for the success of the scientific revolution lay in the acceptance and use of the new science by educated elites. Without such acceptance, the science of Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Boyle, and Newton would have remained the specialized knowledge of the few, or, worse still, a suspect, even heretical, approach to nature. Galileo could not have succeeded as much as he did in disseminating his theories despite the hostility of the Church without his large European following and his many aristocratic patrons, particularly in Florence. Access to the printing press in Europe was also critical to the acceptance of the new mechanical understanding of nature. Descartes understood that fact when he left France, after the condemnation of Galileo, and published and lived in the Netherlands. Persecution and censorship meant that the new science made far less of an impact in Catholic than in Protestant Europe. It is not accidental that most of the leaders within the scientific movement wrote and published in their native languages, not in Latin. What is the Enlightenment? According to Steven Pinker, there is no official answer, because the era named by Kant's essay was never demarcated by opening and closing ceremonies like the Olympics, nor are its tenets stipulated in an oath or creed. The Enlightenment is conventionally placed in the last two-thirds of the 18th century, though it flowed out of the scientific revolution and the Age of Reason in the 17th century and spilled into the heyday of classical liberalism of the first half of the 19th. Provoked by challenges to conventional wisdom from science and exploration, mindful of the bloodshed of recent wars of religion, and abetted by the easy movement of ideas and people, the thinkers of the Enlightenment sought a new understanding of the human condition. The era was a cornucopia of ideas, some of them contradictory, but four themes tie them together: reason, science, humanism, and progress. The promoters of science and religious tolerance had secured new freedoms, many of them given by sleight of hand. Rationality and order, imitative of the order found in Newton's universe, seemed to be gaining momentum. The leaders of the Enlightenment sought to impose an ordered freedom on social and political institutions. They were prepared to attack in print, though sometimes anonymously, the attitudes and beliefs that stood in the way of tolerance, freedom, and rationality. As combative intellectuals and pundits, they earned the name philosophes, simply the French word for philosophers, now used in many languages to describe the bold and witty satirists of clergymen, courtiers, and the pious in general. Thinkers as diverse as Voltaire in France, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson in America, and Immanuel Kant (1724–1804), an abstract philosopher in Germany, may be labeled philosophes. Political thinkers of the Enlightenment were ambivalent toward much of the writing of Thomas Hobbes (1588–1679). All, however, liked his belief that self-interest is a valid reason for engaging in political activity and his refusal to bring God into his system to justify the power of kings. Hobbes said that power did not rest on divine right but arose out of a contract made among men who agreed to elevate the state, and hence the monarch, to a position of power over them. That contract, once made, could not be broken. As a consequence, the power of the government, whether embodied in a king or a parliament, was absolute. Hobbes published his major work, Leviathan, in 1651, when England had just emerged from civil war, thus, he was obsessed with the issue of political stability. Thomas Hobbes wrote the Leviathan. He argued that human beings are violent by nature. Life in nature is nasty, brutish, and short too. People must form a contract with a ruler who will have total power and keep order. 3. He believed that the best form of government is an absolute monarchy, because individual freedoms lead to chaos. For Hobbes, the state was, as he put it, a mortal god, the only guarantee of peace and stability. He was the first political thinker to realize the extraordinary power that had come into existence with the creation of strong centralized governments. Most Enlightenment theorists, however, beginning with John Locke, denied that governments possessed absolute power over their subjects, and to that extent they repudiated Hobbes. Probably the most widely read political philosopher during the first half of the 18th century was John Locke (1632–1704). Locke came to maturity in the late 1650s, and like so many of his contemporaries, he was drawn to science. Although he was a medical doctor, his major interest lay in politics and political theory. His two treatises of government was seen as a justification for the English Revolution of 1688 to 1689 and the notion of government by consent of the people. Although the treatises were published in 1690, Locke wrote them before the Glorious Revolution. That fact, however, was not known during the Enlightenment. Locke's theory, in its broad outlines, stated that the right to govern derived from the consent of the governed and was a form of contract. When people gave their consent to a government, they expected it to govern justly, protect their property, and ensure certain liberties for the propertied. If a government attempted to rule absolutely and arbitrarily, if it violated the natural rights of the individual, it reneged on its contract and forfeited the loyalty of its subjects. Such a government could legitimately be overthrown. Locke believed that a constitutional government that limited the power of rulers offered the best defense of property and individual rights. He also advocated religious toleration for religious groups whose beliefs did not threaten the state. Locke denied toleration to Catholics because of their association with the Stuarts and to atheists because their oaths to God could not be trusted. He also promoted the necessity for education, particularly for those who saw themselves as the natural leaders of society. And not least, he advocated commerce and trade as one of the foundations of England's national strength. John Locke wrote two treatises on government. He argued that human beings are born basically neutral, like a blank slate or a tabula rasa. People form a contract with a ruler, but they have the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. If the leader is a tyrant and breaks the social contract, subjects have the right to rebel. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Not until the 1760s did democracy find its champion, Jean-Jacques Rousseau (1712–1778). Rousseau based his political philosophy on contract theory and his reading of Hobbes. For Rousseau, the people choose their government and, in so doing, effectively give birth to civil society. But he further demanded, in contrast to Hobbes, that the contract be constantly renewed and that government be made immediately and directly responsible to the will of the people. The social contract opened with this stirring cry for reform: man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, and went on to ask how that restriction could be changed. Freedom is in the very nature of man. To renounce liberty is to renounce being a man, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. 6 human beings are born free and innocent in the state of nature, only society and government corrupt them. Rousseau's political ideal was the city-state of ancient Greece, where men, but not women, participated actively and directly in politics and were willing to sacrifice self-interest to the community's needs. In the ancient republics, the state was a moral association that made people better and in which good citizenship was the highest form of excellence. In contrast, modern society was prey to many conflicting interests. Rousseau said that the rich and powerful used the state to preserve their advantages and power and that the poor and powerless viewed it as an oppressor. Baron de Montesquieu wrote, on the spirit of laws, "The best model of government is one with multiple branches where power is divided. These branches also should have checks and balances to limit one another." He admired the English system of government which already had this system in place. Enlightened despotism. Enlightened despotism, an apparent contradiction in terms, was a phrase used by the French philosophe Diderot as early as the 1760s. Wherever the philosophies used this term, it referred to an ideal shared by many of them, the strong monarch who would implement rational reforms, removing obstacles to freedom, ending book censorship, and allowing the laws of nature to work, particularly in trade and commerce. When historians use the term enlightened despotism, they generally are describing the reigns of specific European monarchs and their ministers: Frederick the Great in Prussia, Catherine the Great in Russia, Charles III in Spain, Maria Theresa and, to a greater extent, her son Joseph II in Austria, and Louis XV in France. These 18th-century monarchs instituted specific reforms in education, trade, and commerce and against the clergy. This type of enlightened government must be understood in context. These countries developed late relative to the older states of Europe. Prussia, Austria, and Russia had to move very quickly if they were to catch up to the degree of centralization achieved in England and France. And when monarchies in France and Spain also occasionally adopted techniques associated with enlightened despotism, they generally did so to compete against a more advanced rival, for example, France against England or Spain against France. The Enlightenment and the modern world enlightened thought culminated a trend begun by Renaissance humanists, who attacked medieval otherworldliness and gave value to individual achievement and the worldly life. It was a direct outgrowth of the scientific revolution, which provided a new method of inquiry and verification and demonstrated the power and self-sufficiency of the human intellect. If nature were autonomous, that is, if it operated according to natural laws without the need of divine intervention, then the human intellect also could be autonomous. Through its own powers, the mind could uncover the general principles that operate in the social world, as well as in nature. The philosophies sought to analyze nature, government, religion, law, economics, and education by thinking for themselves, with little reference to Christian teachings, and they rejected completely the claims of clerics to a special wisdom. The philosophers broke decisively with the medieval view that the individual is naturally depraved, that heaven is the true end of life, and that human values and norms derive from a higher reality and are made known through revelation. Instead, they upheld the potential goodness of the individual, regarded the good life on earth as the true purpose of existence, and insisted that individuals could improve themselves and their society by the light of reason. In addition, the political philosophies of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau rested on an entirely new, and modern, concept of the relationship between the state and the individual. States should exist not simply to accumulate power but also to enhance human happiness. From that perspective, monarchy, and even oligarchy not based on merit, began to seem increasingly less useful. And if happiness is a goal, then it must be assumed that some sort of progress is possible in history. In conclusion, the ideals of the Enlightenment are products of human reason, but they always struggle with other strands of human nature: loyalty to tribe, deference to authority, magical thinking, the blaming of misfortune on evildoers. The second decade of the 21st century has seen the rise of political movements that depict their countries as being pulled into a hellish dystopia by malign factions that can be resisted only by a strong leader who wrenches the country backward to make it great again. These movements have been abetted by a narrative shared by many of their fiercest opponents, in which the institutions of modernity have failed and every aspect of life is in deepening crisis, the two sides in macabre agreement that wrecking those institutions will make the world a better place. Harder to find is a positive vision that sees the world's problems against a background of progress that it seeks to build upon by solving those problems in their turn.